Hello, my name is Mirco Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. Shared responsibility sounds like a mature way to run a company, and it's the kind of phrase leaders use when they want to signal balance without sounding too controlling. But inside the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, this idea often creates the exact opposite outcome of what was intended. Because when everyone is told they own a system, no one is structurally accountable for what actually happens next. It keeps the platform running while the business depends on it every day. And meanwhile, compliance just assumes the right controls are already in place. Somewhere in the middle of that handoff, Teams, SharePoint, and the Power Platform keep scaling across an environment where the human layer was never properly designed. This isn't just a minor oversight in your digital strategy, it's a fundamental gap in how we define ownership. So let me take one step back and explain why this matters for the long-term health of your tenant. The illusion of shared responsibility. At the cloud boundary, shared responsibility is a very real and necessary concept. Microsoft handles the underlying service and physical security, while you are responsible for how you configure the settings and what you allow to happen inside your own tenant. That model makes perfect sense because the line between the provider and the customer is sharp and easy to see. But here's the thing that causes most of the friction we see today. Inside the organization, leaders often copy-paste that same language into places where the boundaries are no longer clear at all. This is where the trouble starts for most enterprises. Inside a typical Microsoft 365 estate, responsibility gets spread thin across IT, security, HR, and the business teams who are actually doing the daily work. Everyone touches the environment and everyone influences the risk, so the phrase, "we all share responsibility," becomes the standard mantra. And why is that a problem? Because while shared sounds collaborative and positive, structurally it usually just means undefined. It means no single person is truly answerable when a team has no owner, or when an external sharing link stays active for 2 years. From a system perspective, that isn't a culture issue first, it's an accountability design failure. The reason this happens is actually quite simple. People inside large organizations don't act based only on what they know, they act based on what the environment makes visible and what they assume someone else already owns. This is the bystander effect translated directly into enterprise collaboration. When multiple people have the ability to intervene, each individual feels less personal pressure to act on a problem. When ownership is ambiguous, staying silent becomes a rational choice for a busy employee. If no one around you is taking action, that inaction itself becomes a signal that the task isn't really yours to handle. What looks like passivity from the outside is actually a predictable system outcome. It isn't laziness or bad intent, but rather a structurally produced form of inaction that makes perfect sense to the people involved. Once you see that pattern, a lot of common frustrations start making much more sense. You begin to understand why team owners leave without being replaced and why those critical access reviews never quite seem to happen. Compliance dashboards might look healthy, but the business reality stays messy because external sharing becomes permanent by accident. Retention policies might exist on paper, but the content still floats around with no classification and no operational steward to watch over it. The people inside your system aren't trying to avoid their jobs, they are just trying to move work forward in an environment that makes responsibility invisible. Modern work makes this situation worse instead of better. Hybrid work removes many of the informal correction loops that organizations used to rely on to keep things tidy. In a physical office, somebody eventually notices the awkward silence or asks, "Who owns a specific site?" during a hallway conversation. In the digital world, that natural friction disappears and requests just sit in shared channels or admin queues. Because the work keeps moving, the absence of accountability becomes much harder to detect until it finally turns into a major risk event. This is why I'm so careful with the phrase shared responsibility when talking to clients. At the platform boundary, it works, but inside the enterprise operating model, it creates a dangerous ownership vacuum. In Microsoft 365, vacuums never stay empty for long. They quickly fill up with stale permissions, ownerless workspaces, and zombie apps that nobody remembers creating. Eventually, this leads to a deep loss of trust in the platform itself. The real issue here isn't just the security exposure, it's the long-term confidence of your leadership team. When leaders can't answer who owns data quality or business fit, the platform stops feeling governable and starts feeling risky by default. Once that happens, every new capability you roll out lands in the same broken pattern. Team scales the confusion, Power Platform automates it, and Copilot surfaces it for everyone to see. The technology is doing exactly what it was designed to do, it's just not operating inside a human accountability model strong enough to carry the weight. Once we see that pattern clearly, the incidents stop looking like random accidents. Incident 1, the Orphaned team. Let me make this concrete by looking at how a project actually starts. Usually it happens fast. A team gets created for a finance transformation, a merger work stream, a legal review, or some urgent restructuring program. People join quickly and files start piling up, which means channel conversations soon become the real record of every major decision. Someone invites an outside advisor, another person shares a folder with a vendor, and someone else uploads drafts that were never meant to live beyond the project anyway. For a while, everything looks fine because the team is active and the work is moving. The business gets what it needs, but then the project lead leaves. Maybe they change roles or leave the company entirely. And while the account is offboarded correctly from an HR perspective, nobody translates that departure into a collaboration ownership event. This is where the design flaw shows up. The team still exists, the files and permissions remain, and the external access is still active, but the workspace is no longer governed by anyone who feels accountable for what happens inside it. That is the definition of an orphaned team. The reason this matters is not because it creates a dramatic headline on day one, as the problem is usually much quieter than that. A team like this just keeps sitting there inside the tenant, technically alive but operationally abandoned, while remaining connected to sensitive business content. Financial models, board preparation material, and contract drafts don't disappear just because the person who understood the context is gone. That context leaves with them, and the thing most people miss is that availability is not the same as accountability. A team can still be reachable and usable while having no real human steward behind it, and from a system perspective, that represents a form of structural negligence. This doesn't happen because someone intended harm, but because the environment allowed business-critical context to persist without a clear owner. Research on Microsoft 365 governance keeps pointing back to the same pattern where every workspace needs defined ownership to prevent unmanaged sites. The rule is simple. If no one owns the site, it becomes unmanaged. Now map that to business reality. In a large tenant, nobody can manually remember which spaces still matter or which ones lost their original owner 6 months ago. If ownership transfer is not built into the operating model, it will fail predictably rather than occasionally. That's why orphaned workspaces are such a useful signal, as they reveal the difference between technical custody and true business sovereignty. IT can confirm the service is healthy and the storage is available, but none of that answers the actual business question of who is answerable for the information now. If the answer to that question is silence, then the workspace is running without sovereignty. It's being hosted, but it's not being owned. I've seen organizations discover this only when an audit happens or when a legal request comes in and suddenly the room gets quiet because nobody can explain who owned the outcome. That is the real incident. The organization confuses persistence with control, assuming that because the team is still there, someone must be looking after it. But here's the thing, systems do not create accountability just by continuing to run. They only create the illusion of it, and in Microsoft 365, that illusion can last a very long time. This is especially true in large estates where creation is frictionless and offboarding is treated as an identity event instead of a business ownership event. When you find an orphaned team, don't treat it as an isolated cleanup task, but rather treat it as a design signal. It tells you the platform is optimized to create collaboration spaces faster than your organization is able to sustain accountability for them. Why orphaned workspaces happen? So why does this keep happening? It happens because most organizations have optimized workspace creation but never operationalized ownership continuity. We made it easy to spin up a team or a Power Platform environment through self-service and speed, but we didn't build the same discipline for when the original business context changes. Creation feels like productivity, while ownership transfer feels like administration, so one gets funded while the other gets assumed. This is where a lot of Microsoft 365 governance quietly breaks. It looks at the workspace and sees a healthy service object that follows tenant configuration, so the platform appears under control. However, the business interacts with it as a live work container where decisions happen and access implies trust. That business context is almost never visible through technical health alone, leading IT to assume the local team owns the meaning, while the local team assumes IT owns the structure. Compliance assumes policy coverage means someone is watching, and HR assumes offboarding ends when the account is removed. An orphan is created through these four partial assumptions that never connect. This clicked for me when I started looking at offboarding as a transfer of sovereignty event, rather than just a user lifecycle event. If a person leaves and nobody asks what business spaces depended on their judgment, then the organization has only removed an identity without reassigning accountability. A lot of leaders still confuse access with ownership. They think that because other people are still in the team, the work isn't blocked and everything is fine. From a system perspective, that's not resilience. It's fragility. Access keeps work moving, but accountability keeps risk bounded, and without that distinction, collaboration creates a hidden single point of failure. A team can have 20 members and still be owner fragile if all stewardship depends on one person understanding why the space exists. The number of users doesn't create redundancy, but named stewardship does. So what does better design look like? First, you need at least 2 real owners for continuity, meaning 2 people who actually understand the purpose of the workspace. Second, ownership has to be visible enough that the answer is immediate when someone asks who owns the space. Third, review cycles have to exist, whether people remember or not, because if ownership review depends on someone noticing a problem, you have optimism instead of governance. Finally, HR events and collaboration events need to be connected. If an owner leaves or changes roles, that should trigger a reassessment because the business context has changed. Most workspace governance problems are not really permission problems first, but are actually continuity problems that show up as a mess later. No operational mechanism exists to keep ownership alive as the organization moves through reorgs, project closures, and vendor changes. All of these shifts change the human layer faster than the technical layer changes itself. If your accountability model is static while your organization is dynamic, orphaned workspaces are an inevitable output rather than an accident. I keep coming back to structural resilience because if one person leaving can turn a workspace into an unmanaged risk, the model was never resilient. It was only convenient. Now map that same pattern to external sharing. Incident 2, external sharing that never closes. Now I want you to take that same failure of ownership and move it from your internal workspace to the very edge of your network. Think about the pressure a typical business user feels on a Tuesday morning. A partner needs a file to hit a deadline, a vendor is waiting for folder access to start their work, or a legal advisor needs to review a draft before a high-stakes meeting. In that moment, someone creates a sharing link because it only takes a few seconds and feels incredibly efficient. There is no ticket to file and no friction to slow things down, so the work keeps moving while everyone feels like the platform is finally helping them instead of getting in the way. That feeling of speed is real, and let's be clear. External sharing is a vital part of how modern business functions. The problem here isn't that you granted access to someone who needed it, but rather what happens to that access once the reason for it completely disappears. Projects end and vendors change, yet the digital doors we opened often stay unlocked long after the guests have gone home. Because there is no dramatic alert or obvious system failure, these permissions persist quietly in the background as a link or a guest account that nobody ever thinks to close. This is a perfect example of the digital bystander effect where everyone assumes someone else is watching the gate. The person who made the link assumes it has guardrails in place, while IT assumes the site owner understands the content well enough to manage it. Meanwhile, the compliance team assumes the platform settings will catch any issues, and because the access is no longer top of mind for anyone, it simply stays active. Research into Microsoft 365 governance consistently points to the need for review cycles and ownership checks because access granted for a good reason becomes a massive risk when there is no process to revisit it. Most people miss the fact that this kind of exposure doesn't usually start with someone being reckless or lazy. It starts as a simple convenience under heavy delivery pressure, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous for an organization. It doesn't feel like a risky act to share a folder, it just feels like getting your job done. Because this behavior feels so normal, we rarely design a strong ending for it, meaning we are great at the opening move but terrible at the close. You eventually end up with external sharing that acts like sediment at the bottom of a lake, building up one layer and one project at a time. Over months or years, these small decisions create a long tail of unmanaged access that no leader would ever approve if they saw the entire picture at once. This isn't a single catastrophic event, but rather the slow accumulation of unresolved permissions that nobody is tracking anymore. I have seen SharePoint sites that still have live external access years after the original sponsor left the company, and the current team can't even explain why those guests are there. This doesn't happen because people are careless, but because the organization hasn't assigned a final accountable human to handle the closure. If your system relies entirely on human memory, then cleanup becomes an optional task that will never happen consistently at scale. In the world of Microsoft 365, scale is exactly what turns a minor convenience into a major corporate exposure. A single temporary share isn't the issue, but 1,000 temporary shares without an ownership model creates a structural failure. From a system perspective, this tells me the organization knows how to grant access but has no idea who is answerable for taking it away. This is a sovereignty problem where the platform is under technical custody, but the business logic is missing. The controls and guest settings all exist in the tenant, yet the actual business decision about when a relationship ends has no reliable owner attached to it. Once that happens, the permission lives longer than the purpose, and the environment starts carrying historical trust relationships that no longer match your current reality. You end up with former suppliers and old advisors who stay connected to your sensitive information because nobody was explicitly told to say, "This should stop now." If you remember nothing else from this section, remember that the risk isn't in the initial act of sharing. The real danger is the unmanaged persistence of that access after the business justification has vanished, turning your speed into a liability. The hidden cost of convenience. I want to stay with this pattern for a moment because this is where many leaders underestimate the true cost to the business. External sharing itself is not the problem, but unmanaged sharing is a completely different animal that requires a different strategy. If you work with agencies, auditors, or delivery partners, you absolutely need a way to collaborate beyond your own walls. That is just the reality of doing business today, but the mistake is thinking the risk lies in the software feature when it actually lives in your operating model. Convenience decisions don't just go away after the meeting ends or the project closes, they turn into long-tail access paths that are hard to see. Because these paths were created through reasonable local decisions, they stay hidden from the people responsible for overall security. Your compliance team can write all the policies they want, and IT can tighten the tenant controls. but the business creates the actual exposure one decision at a time. Every time a link is sent or a folder is opened because speed mattered more than control, the surface area of your risk grows. If the business is creating that exposure, but nobody is accountable for closing it, then you aren't governing collaboration. You are just hoping the defaults save you. Hope is not a control model. And to be even more direct, neither is relying on manual memory. Most organizations are betting that someone will remember the external guest or the temporary link from 3 quarters ago. But people do not work from memory when they are busy. They work from prompts, workflows, and visible ownership. If a review is optional, it will lose to delivery pressure every single time because the system is designed to reward completion rather than closure. That is a system outcome, and once you see it that way, the hidden cost of convenience becomes much larger than just a security risk. You start paying for it in the effort it takes to reconstruct why access exists during an audit, and you pay for it in the drag on your decision-making. Now, I want you to map that reality to a tool like Copilot. If permissions are the map of how your organization trusts people, then unmanaged sharing means your map is fundamentally broken. AI does not fix a broken map. It simply amplifies the errors by surfacing content from a landscape you allowed to become cluttered. Poor closure discipline today will inevitably lead to poor AI confidence tomorrow, which is why this is an operating performance topic. Convenience without closure creates a need for structural compensation where people build workarounds just to keep moving. The link is easy to create, but the review is invisible. The guest invitation is simple, but the revocation is hidden. When you make the start easy and the finish unclear, the people inside your system learn to move first and close later, but later almost never comes. What should happen instead is that the system must force a decision where memory would otherwise fail. You need named owners, regular review cycles, and expiration dates that actually mean something to the people involved. Attestation prompts should be sent to real humans who understand the context, not to a shared mailbox where they will be ignored. We don't do this because we love bureaucracy, but because we want clean trust boundaries that protect the business. Convenience is cheap on the day you use it, but it becomes incredibly expensive when unmanaged access starts accumulating interest across your tenant. We see the same pattern with data retention, where the policies and dashboards exist, but the actual ownership of the information is still missing. Incident 3, retention without ownership. Now, I want you to take that same structural flaw and look at how it plays out in retention. This specific issue is quieter and more administrative than the others, which actually makes it far more dangerous than most leaders realize. On the surface, everything usually looks fine because the policies exist, the labels are published, and Microsoft Purview is configured exactly how the documentation suggests. Compliance can point to their dashboards, IT can show off the technical capability, and the organization can confidently say they have a retention system in place. This is exactly where the illusion becomes dangerous because technical capability is not the same thing as operational reality. You can have a retention policy that is technically active across your entire tenant, while the actual business content inside stays messy, inconsistently classified, or completely ignored by the people who actually create it. From the top down, the environment looks governed, but from the inside, it behaves like unmanaged storage with a compliance sticker slapped on the front. That gap matters immensely because retention only becomes real when a human being is accountable for the business logic behind the data. We have to ask what this content actually is, why it matters to the organization, and how long it needs to stay alive. Someone has to decide who owns the exceptions when a file doesn't fit a predefined label, and someone has to check if classification is actually happening in the field. These are fundamental business questions with heavy compliance implications, yet many organizations treat them like set-and-forget technical toggles. Once you treat human accountability as a technical setting, your control surface becomes purely decorative. The labels and the guidance are all there, but since nobody owns the outcome, the business just keeps moving in its own direction. People continue saving files to Teams, SharePoint, and mailboxes, while documents get copied, renamed, and exported across a dozen different workspaces. Some of that content might get labeled correctly by accident, but a huge portion of it will not. Many teams simply ignore the process because it feels too abstract or too slow to help them finish the work they have on their plates today. Because the platform doesn't stop working, the total absence of operational ownership stays hidden behind a healthy-looking interface. This is the same pattern we see with orphaned workspaces where the system contains a control, but no accountable person is responsible for making that control meaningful in daily life. Compliance might show that labels are available and policies are published, but they usually cannot guarantee that the people inside the business are applying those controls consistently. That is the key distinction we have to make. Control availability is not the same thing as control adoption. Adoption without ownership never scales, and I realized this when I saw how often leaders confuse their retention architecture with their retention reality. They assume that if the tenant supports a policy, then the policy must be working, but retention isn't a network setting you just toggle on. It depends entirely on the meaning of the content, and that meaning does not live in the IT department. It lives in the business. If the business doesn't own the classification and the life cycle, then compliance is just a projection layer over unmanaged behavior. The dashboard stays green while the lived content estate stays messy underneath, and this is where AI makes the problem much more urgent. If your information estate is full of stale documents and duplicated files, then any AI capability sitting on top of that environment is drawing from a system with low sovereignty. The platform knows the file exists, but it has no idea if the organization is governing that file with any actual intent. Retention without ownership isn't just a records management headache, it is a fundamental problem for business trust and legal defensibility. When leaders ask if they are retaining what matters and disposing of the rest, the real answer is often, technically maybe, but operationally, not really. If your compliance depends on luck or a few well-trained teams, you don't have governance, you have retention theater. The question is no longer whether your controls exist, but who is actually responsible for the outcomes those controls were supposed to produce. The real cost of no ownership. When you look at these three patterns together, orphaned workspaces, persistent sharing, and retention without use, the problem is impossible to dismiss as simple admin noise. This isn't about isolated gaps in your governance, it's about what happens to business performance when your primary work platform has no clear chain of accountability. Most leaders hear the word ownership and immediately think about security or audit risks. And while those are real, the true cost is much broader. The first thing that breaks is trust in the platform itself, not because the software is buggy, but because the organization can't explain who owns what. When people don't trust their environment, they naturally slow down and start creating side channels or duplicating files locally just to feel safe. They escalate simple decisions that should have been obvious and avoid the governed path because it feels too confusing to rely on for real work. This is pure business drag, and it happens because ambiguity is incredibly expensive for any organization to maintain. If nobody knows who can decide on access or exceptions, then every single non-routine situation turns into a long, drawn-out negotiation. You end up asking who approves this guest, who can archive this site, or who is allowed to say no when a process doesn't make sense. If those questions stay fuzzy, work doesn't stop, but it becomes much heavier and more political for everyone involved. That is the hidden tax the system charges the business every day for having unclear ownership. Audit teams spend their time reconstructing old decisions, IT chases context they never had, and business teams spend their days bypassing the system just to get things done. Now, map that friction to something like Copilot or the Power Platform, and the cost becomes even more obvious to the bottom line. The usefulness of an AI depends on permissions and content quality, so if your ownership is weak, your AI results will be weak too. The AI doesn't underperform because the model is bad, it fails because the environment underneath it is completely unmanaged. Messy permissions lead to noisy grounding, and stale content leads to weak relevance, which eventually causes leaders to say the AI is disappointing. In reality, the platform is just revealing an accountability problem that was already there long before the AI arrived. We see the same thing with citizen development in Power Apps and Power Automate, which can accelerate work until those apps become zombie automation. These are flows and agents that are still running and affecting real business processes, yet no one can say who is accountable for the logic or the data path. Research on low-code governance warns us that without clear stewardship, large portions of these estates become unsupported risks that leave the business vulnerable. From a system perspective, that isn't innovation. It is an unmanaged dependency that eventually leads to a collapse in trust. The business feels this as accumulated hesitation, more cleanup projects, and more heroic individuals who have to compensate for a broken structure. No ownership is not just a failure of control, it is a structural drag that makes your platform harder to scale and harder to trust. If Microsoft 365 is your enterprise operating system, then infrastructure without accountability doesn't create speed, it just creates fragility with a very polished interface. Technical custody versus business sovereignty. There is one specific distinction that clears up almost all the confusion around ownership. We have to stop treating technical custody and business sovereignty as the same thing, because most organizations collapse these two into one vague idea they call ownership, and that is a massive mistake. Technical custody means a team is responsible for keeping the platform available, secure, and running within the right policy boundaries at the service level. This usually sits with IT, platform engineering, or the security operations team who manage identity and tenant controls. These are the people who make sure the tenant actually works, keep authentication running, and configure the layers around Teams, SharePoint, and the Power Platform. They maintain the admin models and keep the service healthy enough for the rest of the company to depend on it. That role matters immensely because without technical custody, your platform becomes unstable, unsafe, and impossible to scale. But here's the thing, technical custody does not tell you what your data actually means. It cannot tell you who should have access in business terms or whether a specific workspace still serves a valid purpose for a project. It won't tell you if the information inside a folder is current, trusted, or even worth keeping. That requires a completely different layer, which I call business sovereignty. Business sovereignty means the business itself owns the meaning, the value, and the quality of the information flowing through Microsoft 365. It means the business decides what should exist and why it exists, and they define who should use it and when it should finally be deleted. This isn't just a theory. It has to work operationally through named people, specific services, and defined datasets. To put it plainly, IT can host data they should never be classifying on behalf of a department, and compliance can publish policies they have no way of actually enforcing in daily work. Security might restrict a risk they don't fully understand in a business context, while the business depends every day on information it has never structurally agreed to govern. That is the gap where most problems start. The reason this gap is so common is that technical custody is visible. You can see the tenant, the admin center, and the service health dashboards, but business sovereignty is invisible unless you deliberately design for it. You have to ask much harder questions about who owns a collaboration pattern, or who decides if a site still matters. If nobody can answer who is accountable for data quality or the business rule behind a specific flow, then your sovereignty is missing, even if your technical custody is perfect. And this is also where compliance fits into the picture. Compliance is not technical custody, and it isn't business sovereignty either, but rather a third necessary layer that defines your obligations and guardrails. It tells us what must be true, but it can never replace the people who have to live out those truths in their actual work. None of these layers can substitute for the others. If IT tries to absorb business sovereignty, they become a bottleneck and start making context decisions they shouldn't own. If the business expects compliance to handle operational ownership, your governance becomes heavy on paper but light on actual behavior. When the business simply assumes the platform team owns Microsoft 365, accountability just disappears into the technical stack. The better model is to stop asking who owns Microsoft 365 because that question is too big and structurally misleading. Instead, you should ask who has technical custody of the platform, who has service accountability for the business capabilities, and who has sovereignty over the data itself. Once you separate those layers, ownership stops being a philosophical debate and becomes an operational reality. This works because it aligns accountability to the level where decisions actually happen. Platform teams own reliability, service owners own how automation should work, and business owners own the meaning of the information. Technical custody keeps Microsoft 365 running, but business sovereignty is what makes it trustworthy enough for the business to actually run on top of it. Why RACI is not enough. When ownership gets blurry, many leaders reach for the standard corporate answer and try to build a RACI matrix. I understand why they do it, because a chart of who is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed gives people the feeling that ambiguity is finally being reduced. It creates neat boxes and names that can be shown in a steering meeting and then filed away in a project folder. For many programs, that feels like a huge step up from total chaos. But here is the problem. Microsoft 365 is not a one-time project. It is living infrastructure, and living infrastructure does not stay aligned just because a governance chart existed on the day your workshop ended. A RACI is static, but your environment is dynamic. A chart can tell you who was supposed to be responsible when a service launched, but it won't tell you who is exercising that ownership 6 months later. When a team owner leaves the company or external sharing patterns start to drift, a static document can't help you. This is the gap leaders keep stepping into because they confuse documented role clarity with actual operational accountability. On paper, someone might be accountable for collaboration, but in reality, nobody is watching how external sharing is being used as an ongoing business capability. RACI is useful for defining relationship logic, but it fails to create living stewardship. Microsoft 365 keeps changing even when your governance documents stay the same. New teams are created, projects end, roles shift, and citizen developers build new automations every day. If your ownership model only exists as a static artifact, the platform will outgrow that document almost immediately. From a system perspective, this means your controls are too far away from the behavior they are supposed to govern. When controls sit too far away, they become ceremonial, and you end up with the language of accountability without any of the actual mechanics. This is why a service ownership model is much more effective for modern work. Service ownership doesn't just ask who was consulted when a policy was written, it asks who is continuously answerable for the quality, the access model, and the business fitness of a living service. This standard assumes continuity and regular review. It requires measurable stewardship rather than just a documented intent from a meeting that happened a year ago. Instead of asking who is responsible for collaboration in a general sense, we need to ask sharper questions. We need to know who owns the team's collaboration service as a business capability and who owns the data quality conditions required for Copilot to be safe. When you define ownership this way, the conversation gets real because services can be measured and reviewed. Services can survive a reorganization if the ownership is embedded properly and they create a clear path for escalation when things start to drift. That is what leaders actually need to see. They don't need more boxes on a chart or better workshop outputs. They need operational continuity through a named human with the authority to carry accountability over time. This also changes how you think about failure. In a RACI world, failure usually turns into archaeology, where people dig through old documents to see who is marked as accountable. In a service ownership world, failure becomes visible much earlier because you can see if reviews are happening and if the lifecycle discipline is actually working. If Microsoft 365 is going to be part of your enterprise operating system, then ownership cannot live only in governance paperwork. It has to live inside the operating model itself. You can use a RACI if it helps clarify supporting roles, but do not mistake it for a real accountability system. In a platform this dynamic, you need ownership that stays alive while the environment keeps moving. The service ownership model for Microsoft 365. Let's define a model that an enterprise can actually run without it collapsing under its own weight. The core principle here is simple. You do not own Microsoft 365 as one giant monolithic entity. Instead, you own specific business services inside of it. That distinction matters because the platform is far too broad and moves too fast to be governed by one abstract owner sitting at the top of the org chart. When leaders ask who owns Microsoft 365, they usually collapse 10 different kinds of accountability into one vague sentence, and that is exactly how true ownership disappears. The service ownership model fixes this by moving accountability closer to the capability the business is actually using every day. We aren't looking at the whole platform, but rather the specific service, the collaboration pattern, or the business outcome. Instead of one oversized ownership question, we create smaller, much more governable ones that people can actually answer. We need to know who owns Teams collaboration for project delivery and who is responsible for external sharing as a business capability. We have to identify who owns the publishing model for the intranet, the discipline for Power Platform environments, and the data conditions that make Copilot safe and trustworthy. Now map those questions to operating reality. Each of those areas carries different risks and serves different users, which means they have unique lifecycle needs and failure modes. Because of that variety, every service needs a named accountable owner who can make real decisions and remain answerable for those trade-offs over time. That owner isn't expected to do everything personally because that would be a single point of failure. The role isn't about centralizing all the manual work, but rather centralizing the accountability for the outcome. This means you have one clearly named point of answerability, supported by technical custodians and compliance functions where they are needed most. This is where a lot of organizations get stuck because they think named accountability means rebuilding a slow hierarchy. Actually, the opposite is usually true. When ownership is clear, decisions move faster because the escalation path is visible to everyone involved. Questions stop bouncing between IT security and business teams, and those awkward exceptions stop sitting in meeting notes for months. So what does a service owner actually own? At a minimum, they own access, lifecycle, quality, and business fit. Access means the owner is accountable for how the service should be used and who gets in, focusing on the business logic rather than every individual admin setting. Lifecycle means they are responsible for how a service begins, changes, and eventually ends, ensuring workspaces don't just drift into eternity. Quality means the owner is accountable for whether the service is producing a trustworthy environment, which is a much more realistic goal than perfection. They check if permissions are drifting or if workspaces are still aligned to their original purpose. Finally, business fit ensures the service still supports how the organization actually works today, not how a policy document imagined it would work 2 years ago. Microsoft 365 keeps evolving, so the owner has to maintain continuity while the platform changes underneath them. This is why I prefer service ownership over generic governance committees as the primary control point. Committees can advise and align, but they are rarely good at carrying continuous operational accountability. A committee won't notice drift unless someone brings it into the room, but a service owner lives close enough to the capability to see it happening in real time. That proximity is the value because it turns governance from a theory into a living operating responsibility. It also makes accountability survive change when people leave or teams reorganize. If ownership lives only in tribal knowledge, it breaks the moment the environment shifts. If it lives in a named service model with visible expectations, it has a much better chance of surviving the natural movement of the organization. The real test isn't whether you can assign names in a workshop, but whether that accountability survives staff changes and reorganizations without collapsing back into ambiguity. You do not govern Microsoft 365 by assigning ownership to the platform as a whole. You govern it by assigning accountable owners to the business services and information domains that your organization actually depends on to function. Layer 1, platform ownership. Now let's look at the first layer, which is platform ownership. This is usually where organizations begin their journey, and honestly, that makes a lot of sense. Somebody has to own the tenant and keep identity working while ensuring the baseline control environment is stable enough for the business to trust. In most enterprises, this responsibility sits with IT or platform engineering, and their job is anything but small. They own the tenant health, the identity model, and the core configuration across Teams, SharePoint, and the Power Platform. These teams manage the admin boundaries and the provisioning frameworks that stop the whole environment from turning into total chaos. This matters more than many leaders admit because if platform ownership is weak, every other conversation about service or data ownership becomes theoretical very quickly. If authentication is inconsistent or if admin roles are unclear, the business simply cannot build trustworthy operating patterns on top of that foundation. So yes, this first layer is foundational, but we have to keep one line very clear. Platform ownership is not the same as owning business decisions. This is the trap where central IT often finds itself caught. Because the platform team is visible and has admin access, the rest of the organization starts treating them as the default owner for everything. Permissions questions, lifecycle issues, and even the meaning of specific content all get dumped on IT. Suddenly, the team responsible for keeping the environment running is being asked to govern context they don't actually own. From a system perspective, that isn't just inefficient, it's dangerous. When platform ownership gets confused with total ownership, central IT becomes a bottleneck and a surrogate decision maker for a business reality they cannot fully interpret. IT can enforce a naming convention or configure an expiration policy, but they cannot decide if a project site still has actual business value. An IT admin cannot determine the legal intent of a file or decide if a specific team's space still reflects a valid collaboration need. Those are service or data questions, not platform questions. Good platform ownership has to be disciplined enough to stop at the right boundary so the system can function properly. The health of the platform depends on standardization, automation, and observability. Standardization means the environment behaves predictably so that core controls aren't being reinvented by every department. Automation ensures the platform doesn't rely on manual heroics to stay governed, using repeatable logic for workspace creation and reviews. Observability means the platform team can actually see what is happening, looking for ownership gaps and policy drift rather than just service uptime. That is what strong platform ownership looks like in practice. It creates the rails and the control plane while reducing unnecessary variance, giving the business a stable foundation to operate on. However, we shouldn't pretend that a stable platform is the same thing as a governed business. A tenant can be technically well run and still be full of ownerless workspaces and unmanaged automations. That doesn't mean the platform team failed. It just means the platform layer was mistaken for the entire model. Platform ownership is accountable for making Microsoft 365 reliable, secure, and observable, but it is not accountable for carrying business sovereignty for everyone else. Once that boundary is clear, the platform team stops being forced into every minor decision. This is the exact moment when true service ownership finally becomes possible. Layer 2, service ownership. Once you have clear boundaries for your platform, it is finally time to address the layer that most organizations completely skip over. I'm talking about service ownership. This is the critical layer that translates what a tenant can do into what the business actually experiences, because while a platform gives you the tools, services define how those tools are supposed to work for your specific organization. If nobody owns that middle ground, the entire system collapses back into local improvisation and messy workarounds. A service owner is not just a person who toggles settings in an admin center, nor are they simply the person tasked with writing every single policy PDF. Instead, the service owner is the named, accountable individual who ensures a collaboration or productivity capability operates as a legitimate business service. They sit right between technical custody and business usage, which means they are close enough to the business to understand the operating need, but close enough to the platform to shape patterns responsibly. Think about how your team uses Teams for collaboration. I'm not talking about Teams as a software product, but rather Teams as a service for project work, cross-functional delivery, and internal communication. Somebody needs to own the logic of how that service functions, including what a good team looks like and when one should be created in the first place. They define the ownership minimums, decide when a workspace should expire, and figure out how to handle guest access or exceptions when the standard pattern breaks down. The same logic applies to external sharing, which is far more than just a checkbox in an admin center. External sharing is a business capability that serves as a controlled way to extend trust outside your organization so you can work with clients, suppliers, and partners. If no one owns that service as an operating model, all you really have is a technical feature paired with a document that nobody reads, and that is never enough to maintain security at scale. You can see this pattern everywhere, from SharePoint publishing and project collaboration to Power Platform environment discipline and even Copilot enablement. Each of these represents a service domain that affects real business outcomes, and each one needs a named owner who can answer a very simple question. They must be able to say whether a capability is operating the way the business needs it to, with acceptable risk and a clear life cycle. This is fundamentally different from general governance because governance committees tend to spend their time discussing, while service owners actually have to decide. While governance boards focus on aligning stakeholders, service owners carry the burden of answerability when drift appears or when local exceptions start becoming systemic patterns. That makes the role operational rather than ceremonial, and a high-performing service owner usually focuses on four specific areas: the operating model, the rules of use, the risk posture, and the life cycle design. When we talk about the operating model, we mean the owner defines how the service works in practice by deciding which patterns are standard and what gets automated. They shape the rules of use by defining who should use the service and under what conditions, while also managing the risk posture to know where flexibility is fine and where boundaries are non-negotiable. Finally, they manage the lifecycle design to ensure every service has a clear beginning, a review logic, and a definitive ending. That last part matters more than most leaders realize because services without lifecycle ownership eventually become cluttered, risky, and politically impossible to clean up. You might think this still belongs to IT, and while the owner might sit in an IT-adjacent function, the role itself must be aligned with business outcomes. If a service is fundamentally about how work happens, the owner needs enough authority to shape that experience, or the model becomes technically correct but operationally weak. Service ownership acts as the bridge between high-level strategy and day-to-day enforcement. The owner does not personally configure every label or review every single guest, but they are accountable for making sure the automation and escalation paths exist, so the service stays governable over time. This is why service ownership makes governance real, as it gives the organization a named place where ambiguity finally stops. Once an owner exists for external sharing or project collaboration, the conversation changes from who should look at this to who is answerable for this service and what needs to change. This is a much more mature way to operate because it turns governance from a shared, vague concern into a concrete operating responsibility. However, these services still sit on top of something even more important, which is the content itself, and that requires its own layer of ownership. Layer 3, data ownership. This brings us to the third layer, which is data ownership. This is the specific level where governance either becomes a reality or stays purely performative. At the end of the day, Microsoft 365 is not valuable because it contains a suite of apps like SharePoint or Copilot, but rather because those services carry the information your business depends on to function. We are talking about contracts, financial records, project files, and customer material that drive your daily operations. If nobody in the business owns the meaning, quality, and life cycle of that information, then every system built on top of it becomes inherently unstable. This is why I always separate service ownership from data ownership in my architectural thinking. A service owner defines how a capability operates, but they should not be expected to decide what a document means or how long a specific record matters to the legal team. That responsibility belongs to the business, and it needs to be assigned specifically rather than vaguely. A data owner is accountable for what the content is, why it exists, and who should be allowed to access it. This is a serious responsibility because once information starts driving financial decisions or AI-generated recommendations, poor ownership becomes a direct business liability. Many organizations stay immature here because they treat data like an IT possession just because a platform stores it, or they treat it like a compliance abstraction that only matters during an audit. Information is a business asset with operational consequences, and if the business depends on it, the business has to own it. This has become especially critical now that Copilot has changed the stakes for everyone. The usefulness of AI is not just a question of which model you use, but a question of data ownership, because if your files are stale, duplicated, or overshared, the AI outputs will reflect that mess. The AI isn't broken. It is simply telling the truth about the poor condition of your information estate. I often say that AI readiness is really just ownership maturity in disguise. If you want to have trusted AI, you must have trusted data. And that requires named business ownership at every level. In practice, this means business units own the meaning, the classification intent, and the quality expectations of their own data. They are the ones who must decide what should exist, what needs protection, and what has finally outlived its value to the company. This does not mean a senior executive needs to manually label every single file in a folder. We have to separate high-level accountability from day-to-day stewardship, where a senior leader is answerable, but the actual work is handled by process owners or site managers. Scalable ownership is never about one heroic person doing everything, but rather about clear accountability supported by a distributed network of people who are closer to the actual work. Without this distinction, leaders tend to avoid ownership because it feels too detailed, or they assign it so high up the chain that nobody actually operationalizes the rules. The right model is simple. You need executive accountability paired with operational stewardship and a visible link between the two. Visibility is the key here because invisible ownership is usually no ownership at all, and if nobody can say who owns a critical dataset, you are already relying on luck. From a system perspective, failing to manage data ownership creates two major problems at once. First, you get weak decisions because people cannot fully trust the information they are using to do their jobs. Second, you get weak controls because no one is clearly answerable for whether that information is being governed correctly. That combination is dangerous because once data is surfaced by AI or reused across workflows, low-quality ownership scales your problems faster than any policy can contain them. Platform ownership gives us reliability and service ownership gives us operating accountability, but data ownership is what provides the actual meaning. Meaning is what makes your governance defensible and your AI tools actually useful for the people on the ground. Most leaders eventually realize that governance is not a policy problem, but a design problem centered on who owns meaning inside the system. Once you see that, the next issue becomes obvious. If too many people are vaguely involved, why is no one taking action? The bystander effect inside large organizations. Now we need to look at the human pattern sitting underneath all of this technical complexity. If you look closely, you'll see that unclear ownership is far more than just a governance flaw or a missing checkbox in a spreadsheet. It creates a specific behavioral outcome that we see in every large-scale system, and that outcome is the bystander effect. Most of us recognize the bystander effect from basic psychology, where the more people who are present during an emergency, the less likely any one individual is to step in. Responsibility gets diluted across the group until it disappears entirely. Inside a large organization, that same structural failure shows up in steering groups, shared inboxes, and cross-functional governance boards. You see it in project teams and platform escalations, or those strange situations where 5 smart people all know something is going wrong, yet absolutely nothing happens. This doesn't happen because people are lazy or because nobody cares about the result. It happens because every person in the room assumes someone else is already handling the situation. That specific assumption is what makes large organizations risky in a very predictable way. We often tell ourselves that more stakeholders create more safety, but in reality, more oversight usually just leads to less individual intervention. We think more functions involved means more checks and more committees means better control, but the opposite is usually true. When accountability is vague, every extra layer of management becomes another place to pass the issue sideways. IT thinks compliance is tracking the risk, while compliance assumes the service owner is taking action. Meanwhile, the service owner thinks the business sponsor has the context and the sponsor assumes the platform team has a report. The issue just sits there, fully visible to everyone, but structurally untouched by anyone. This problem gets significantly worse in a hybrid work environment because we lose the social cues that used to trigger human action. You don't overhear a concerned conversation in the corridor anymore, and you can't see the uncertainty on a colleague's face across the office. You don't feel the urgency in the room the same way when you're looking at a message in Teams or a note in a slide deck. Because digital environments flatten urgency, people begin to interpret silence as a sign that everything is normal. This is a classic case of pluralistic ignorance, where people assume that if no one else is acting, the situation must not be urgent. If nobody has escalated the problem yet, you tell yourself it must already be covered by a different department. People hesitate upward because hierarchy makes intervention feel risky, and they hesitate sideways because peer domains feel politically sensitive. Issues drift between different levels of the organization without ever landing in a place of real answerability. Generic cultural slogans like, "If you see something, say something," will never solve this because they are structurally weak. They assume that simple awareness will overcome systemic ambiguity, but awareness without ownership just creates shared concern. Shared concern is not the same thing as action, and this is one of the most important leadership lessons for anyone managing a modern tech stack. Silence in a large organization is often misread as agreement or a lack of capability, but it's actually a system outcome produced by diffused accountability. The people inside your system might see the issue clearly and care deeply about the fix, but if the environment doesn't make it obvious who is supposed to move, they will wait for a stronger signal. That waiting behavior is predictable, and the research shows that when responsibility is diffused, action drops. This maps directly to how we manage Microsoft 365 governance today. If a workspace has no visible owner, the likelihood of someone cleaning it up drops to 0. If external sharing reviews go to generic groups instead of named humans, the quality of those responses will always fail. More people involved does not create control unless responsibility becomes sharper as the group expands. The answer isn't more reminders or more committees, it's a better architecture for accountability. You have to design the environment so that action has a specific place to land. You need a visible owner, a clear escalation path, and a visible consequence when that ownership is missing. You break the bystander pattern by making it structurally clear who is expected to act and what they are answerable for when they don't. Designing ownership into the environment. If the bystander effect is the human pattern we are fighting, then we have to ask how to design an environment where that pattern can't survive. This requires a shift in perspective where we stop treating ownership as a communication problem and start treating it as an environmental design problem. If accountability only lives in policy documents or org charts, it stays too far away from the place where work actually happens. Ownership has to show up inside the workflow itself, specifically during creation, review, and the final life cycle stages. That is where the organization either reinforces accountability or quietly lets it dissolve. The first principle is to make ownership visible from the very beginning. If a team is created or a SharePoint site is provisioned, the owner shouldn't be an afterthought added weeks later. There should be a named accountable person tied to every Power Platform environment and its business purpose at the exact point of entry. If a workspace can be born without visible ownership, the system is allowing ambiguity at the moment it should be preventing it. I would even go one step further and suggest a no owner, no workspace policy for the entire tenant. We would never accept critical physical infrastructure with no accountable operator, so we should stop accepting collaboration infrastructure with no owner. In many cases, having just one owner is actually a continuity risk because it creates a single point of failure. Where the platform supports it, production-grade collaboration should require at least two owners to ensure structural resilience. If one person leaves the company or changes roles, the environment must remain governable. Ownership also has to stay visible long after the initial creation phase is over. This is why metadata and lifecycle logic are so much more than just administrative details for the IT team. The owner needs to be recorded in a way that the reporting layer and the review process can actually see. Invisible ownership cannot be monitored, and what cannot be monitored will eventually decay into a security risk. The next design principle is to ensure reviews are conducted by named humans rather than broadcasting responsibility to a crowd. Most organizations send reminders, but a reminder sent to a shared mailbox is not the same thing as creating true accountability. A message in a Teams channel asking if anyone still needs access is definitely not ownership. The review prompt has to land with a specific person who knows they are answerable for the response. That is how you reduce ambiguity and finally break the bystander pattern. While creation gets all the attention in most companies, closure is where governance either survives or fails. Workspaces need renewal points and access needs regular review because the environment changes every day, even when the governance board isn't meeting. This is where HR events become critical to the health of the system. If ownership only changes when somebody remembers to update a form, your model is already too fragile to scale. Owner transitions should be triggered by joiner, mover, and leaver events whenever possible. If a responsible person leaves the company, their workspaces and automations should automatically trigger reassignment workflows. We do this because automation is reliable while human goodwill is not scalable. That same logic applies to how we categorize different collaboration zones across the business. Not every workspace needs the same intensity of ownership, so sensitive business work should not inherit the same expectations as an open social channel. Different zones need different defaults and review cadences, but every single zone still needs a clear logic for who is in charge. This isn't about creating more bureaucracy. It's about providing operational clarity for the people using the tools. When ownership is built into the environment, people don't need to memorize a complex governance model to act responsibly. The system guides them toward the right behavior and makes it much easier to detect when things are starting to drift. This is the design standard I push for in every environment. Visible ownership, redundancy for continuity, and HR-triggered reassignments. If ownership relies on memory and good intentions, it will fail under pressure, but if it's designed into the environment, it has a real chance to scale. If you audited your own internal ownership structures the same way you audit your technical systems, what would you find? Is your current setup designed to sustain your people, or is the ambiguity slowly draining your operational capacity over time? Entra as the ownership control plane. Once you have designed ownership into your environment, the next question is purely practical. Where does that ownership actually live? For most Microsoft 365 estates, the closest thing to a functional ownership control plane is Microsoft Entra. Identity is where accountability becomes actionable because it is the point where we stop talking about ownership as an abstract idea and start binding it to real humans, specific roles, and actual permissions. This matters because if you cannot see who has the power to act, who can approve a request, or who inherits responsibility when a project moves, then you do not have operational ownership. You have narrative ownership, which is just a story we tell ourselves about who is in charge. Entra is the tool that makes that distinction visible to everyone. From a system perspective, identity is not just about granting access. It is the fundamental accountability infrastructure of your business. It defines who has the authority to manage a group, who can invite a guest into your data, and who is responsible for taking over when a key employee leaves the company. If these identity relationships are weak, hidden, or over-centralized, the entire ownership model sitting above them will start collapsing very quickly. I want to make this architecture decision very clear. Ownership must align with resource responsibility rather than simple convenience. That sounds obvious, but many environments drift in the wrong direction because people get added as owners simply because they were available or because IT needed to move fast. When one admin account becomes the universal fallback for every request, you create hidden escalation paths that make it impossible to tell who is really accountable when a setting changes. And this is why delegated admin scopes are so important for structural resilience. If every minor ownership issue has to route back through central IT, then your technical team becomes a massive operational choke point for a model that was supposed to distribute responsibility. But when Entra roles and group ownership patterns are designed properly, the business can carry real accountability without needing full tenant-level power. That is the balance we are looking for. It is not about removing control, it is about controlled delegation. You want to give the right people the right level of authority over the resources they are expected to own, and nothing more. Group ownership is a massive part of this strategy because so much of the Microsoft 365 experience hangs off teams and related identities. If group ownership is stale or assigned to the wrong people, the whole collaboration layer becomes structurally fragile and difficult to manage. Where the platform supports it, having at least 2 owners should be your default setting for the sake of continuity. This is not meant to blur the lines of accountability, but rather to remove a single point of failure that could halt operations. These owners should reflect real business stewardship instead of just being technical fallback accounts that nobody monitors. The same logic applies to privileged access and how you handle high-risk permissions. This is where privileged identity management becomes relevant for your system design. Sensitive roles should not sit as permanent standing access, because ownership and administration are not the same thing. High-risk permissions should be time-bound and visible to reduce the chance that old role assignments quietly turn into inherited risk. If a low-quality ownership model meets broad privileged access, you don't just get governance drift, you get serious structural exposure. Another thing most organizations miss is the problem of stale ownership. A group can technically have an owner on paper, but still be effectively ownerless if that person changed roles or no longer understands the business context. Identity has to be monitored as a living layer that is constantly reviewed and connected to joiner, mover, and leaver events. Ownership that exists only in directory data but not in a real operating context is just another illusion. If you want one practical way to think about Entra in this context, it is the system that defines who is allowed to carry accountability. It gives structure to your delegation, provides continuity to your ownership, and limits an over-centralized dependence on your IT department. Identity becomes the visible backbone of your ownership model. It is the control plane that lets every other part of your governance model actually function. Before you can govern content or enforce a lifecycle, someone has to be clearly visible as the person who can take action. That visibility always starts with identity. If you audited your identity system today, would you find a clear map of responsibility, or would you find a tangled web of temporary access that became permanent years ago? Purview labels and DLP as structural enforcement. Once identity makes ownership visible, the next layer of the system answers a different question. What happens to the content itself when people move fast, make mistakes, or simply take the most convenient path available? This is where Microsoft Purview, sensitivity labels, and DLP stop being mere compliance features and start becoming structural enforcement for the business. Ownership by itself is never enough, because while ownership defines intent, the platform still needs a way to hold the line when human behavior gets messy. And let's be honest, behavior always gets messy because people are constantly under pressure to deliver results. They share the wrong file, they save sensitive data in the wrong place, or they skip classification entirely because they are trying to get work done. Moving information through familiar, unsecure channels often feels more urgent than following a control process. That is not a personal failing of your staff. It is a normal human reaction to a high-pressure environment. The real question is not whether your people will deviate from the rules, but whether the environment is built to catch those deviations without collapsing into constant manual supervision. Sensitivity labels are powerful because they connect business meaning to technical behavior. They turn the phrase, "this matters," into something the platform can actually recognize and act upon. A label signals confidentiality and protection requirements so the system can apply them consistently across every file and collaboration space. Without these labels, your classification system stays abstract and useless. People hear words like confidential or internal, but unless those words are tied to platform behavior, they remain soft language sitting next to very hard risks. Labels work because they let the business express its intent one time, and then they let the platform carry that intent forward through automated enforcement. This is a much stronger model than hoping every single downstream decision gets remembered correctly by a tired employee. Retention policies work in the exact same way. A policy that exists only in a handbook is not the same thing as retention being real in the daily life of the business. What closes that gap is the connection between ownership, classification, and lifecycle behavior. If the business decides what content means and how long it matters, Purview helps make that decision durable by publishing the rule directly into the environment. It creates consistency and reduces the dangerous dependence on human memory. However, there is an important boundary here that we have to respect. Purview gives you visibility and policy reach, but it does not create ownership on its own. dashboards can show you unlabeled content and reports can show you exposure, but you might still find that nobody is clearly answerable for whether the underlying behavior actually improves. We should never confuse observability with true accountability. Purview helps us see and enforce the rules, but ownership is what decides what those rules should be in the first place. This is where data loss prevention, or DLP, comes in as your non-negotiable layer of protection. This is the point where the organization decides that certain actions simply cannot happen, regardless of the circumstances. Sensitive data should not leave a specific boundary, and certain information patterns should always trigger an interruption or a block. DLP is not there to replace human judgment everywhere, but to create hard edges where the business has decided that flexibility is no longer acceptable. This is where the whole model starts to feel mature because the owner defines the rule, the business gives it meaning, and the platform enforces the boundary. Think about how this looks in real life when a finance team tries to share sensitive material under a tight deadline, or consider a project team that accidentally drops personal information into the wrong SharePoint site. If your governance only exists as awareness, those actions depend on perfect human behavior to avoid a disaster. But if your governance is embedded, the platform can interrupt the mistake at the exact moment it matters most. That is what I call structural resilience. It doesn't happen because your people suddenly become flawless, but because the environment compensates where human consistency naturally runs out. This is also why governance has to be part of the active workflow instead of a cleanup exercise you do after the damage is done. If labels appear too late, they feel like an admin burden, and if DLP only shows up as a surprise punishment, people will just find ways to root around it. When these controls are built into the creation and sharing process, they stop feeling like external friction and start behaving like essential infrastructure. That is the ultimate goal for any system architect. We don't want more policy language, we want more dependable system behavior. Ownership defines the rule. And the combination of Purview and DLP makes that rule survivable under real business conditions. If you look at your current setup, is it designed to catch a mistake, or is it just waiting to report on one after it's too late? Provisioning, lifecycle, and zone strategy. Once you have identity and enforcement handled, you're still left with one major structural question. How does the environment behave by default? If the baseline experience is loose, inconsistent, and easy to bypass, your owners will spend every day fighting an uphill battle. This is exactly why provisioning, lifecycle, and zone strategy matter so much, as they shape the operating environment long before people start improvising inside of it. Provisioning isn't just a technical step. It is the first real moment of governance. It isn't the policy launch or the annual review that defines your system, but rather the creation event itself. This is the specific point where a team, a site, or an environment comes into existence and begins to accumulate people, files, and process dependencies. If that creation moment remains unmanaged, the organization is essentially letting risk walk through the front door with a friendly user interface. I prefer to make the rule very clear. Standardized provisioning should be the norm rather than the exception. This means every workspace is created through a governed path where the purpose is declared, owners are assigned, and basic metadata is captured. When the collaboration pattern is known up front, the right defaults can be applied automatically, preventing a situation where people optimize for speed and the environment inherits ambiguity from day one. I keep coming back to a single architectural principle: no owner, no workspace. In higher dependence scenarios, I'd even argue that if there isn't a second owner, there shouldn't be a production-grade collaboration space. While that sounds strict, it's much better than the alternative, which usually involves a massive retroactive cleanup across thousands of half-governed spaces after the original context has already disappeared. Lifecycle management is the second half of this story, yet most organizations put all their effort into creation and almost none into endings. Governance failure usually shows up at the end of a project's usefulness rather than at the start of the initial enthusiasm. A team begins with a clear purpose, and a power platform solution starts with urgency, but eventually the project ends and the sponsor moves on. When the vendor relationship closes or the team changes, the workspace and its access paths often keep running because nothing in the system forced a question. This is why renewal and expiration policies are so important, serving not as blunt instruments but as prompts for operational truth. They force us to ask if the space still matters, who still owns it, and whether it should be archived or closed. If those questions are never triggered, dead collaboration spaces quickly turn into live security exposures. Then we have zone strategy, which is where governance finally becomes intelligent instead of uniform. Not every form of collaboration carries the same risk or requires the same pace, so one environment shouldn't pretend to support everything through a single design. Open collaboration needs speed, while controlled delivery requires tighter reviews, and sensitive work needs restrictive defaults with almost no assumptions. A better model defines specific zones, such as an open collaboration zone, a controlled project zone, and a regulated zone for sensitive data. You might set up separate Power Platform environments with different rules for experimentation versus critical operations, giving each zone its own provisioning rules and lifecycle expectations. Even with these differences, every zone still preserves the same structural principle of clear ownership from the very start. Now, if you map that to business reality, the benefits become obvious. If a cross-functional team needs to move quickly, you can give them a fast path in the open collaboration zone. If a strategic project holds financial or client-sensitive material, you route it into a controlled zone with stronger defaults and owner attestations. When citizen developers build flows that touch critical data, you keep those out of the default environment and move them into managed zones with visible accountability. This is the point where governance stops being a static document and finally becomes platform behavior. The environment itself starts guiding people into safer operating patterns without demanding they memorize a massive handbook first. Provisioning reduces ambiguity at birth, lifecycle reduces drift over time, and zone strategy aligns your controls with the actual reality of the business. When you put those three together, ownership becomes something the platform expects and reinforces every single day. What to measure if you want sovereignty, not theater. Once the operating model is in place, leaders usually ask how they can actually tell if any of this is working. This is where many governance programs slip back into performance theater by measuring activity instead of outcomes. They track policy counts, the number of meetings held, or how many dashboards are available. And while that sounds mature, none of it actually proves sovereignty. Sovereignty isn't about how much governance language exists around your platform. It's about whether the business can show clear ownership and safe operations inside of it. If you want real sovereignty, you have to measure ownership exactly where the platform is being used. The first metric I look for is ownership coverage, which tells us how much of the estate is visibly owned by a named accountable person. We aren't talking about theoretical ownership where someone in IT probably looks after a site. We need to know the exact percentage of teams, SharePoint sites, and Power Automate flows that can be traced back to a living, accountable role. If you cannot see your ownership coverage, you don't actually know if accountability exists, and many organizations are shocked to find that large parts of their estate are technically active but structurally ownerless. The second metric is policy adherence, which measures whether actual behavior is aligning with the rules you wrote. It's one thing to have a policy for data labeling, but it's another thing entirely to see how much critical content is actually labeled. You need to know how many sensitive workspaces are under the right controls and how much external sharing has been reviewed within the required cycle. A control existing in the tenant is not the same thing as a control shaping business reality. The third metric is cycle time. And this matters because governance that slows down the business will always be bypassed by employees. You should track how long it takes to create a compliant workspace, approve access, or transfer ownership when someone leaves the company. If these processes are too slow, people will improvise and leadership will end up blaming culture for what is actually a structural design problem. Good ownership should reduce friction and make the safe path the fastest and most predictable option for the user. The fourth metric is Copilot usefulness, which is a downstream signal that reveals a lot about your ownership maturity. If AI outputs are low trust, noisy, or risky, that usually isn't an AI problem. It's a signal of messy permissions and stale workspaces. AI is brutally honest about the condition of your information estate. So if the environment isn't becoming more trustworthy, your ownership model isn't working. Finally, there is the metric of auditability, which is what separates a governed environment from one that is just well decorated. You need to be able to show who owns a decision and who was accountable for a specific service or data exception over time. Theater can produce a lot of documents and spreadsheets, but sovereignty produces hard evidence of continuity. If I were advising an executive team today, I would tell them to measure 5 things: ownership coverage, policy adherence, cycle time, Copilot usefulness, and auditability. We don't track these because metrics solve governance, but because measurement reveals whether accountability is alive or just a story we're telling ourselves. If you cannot measure ownership in a way that reflects reality, then you don't actually have ownership at all. Why ownership makes the business faster? A lot of leaders still hesitate when they hear the word ownership because they immediately picture a mountain of control overhead. They imagine more approvals, more rigid processes, and more people asking for signed forms before any real work can actually start. But that reaction usually comes from a history of bad governance memories, rather than a look at good operating design. Clear ownership, when you do it properly, does not slow the business down at all. It actually removes the hesitation and duplicate decision paths that quietly drain your productivity every single day. Most organizations have simply learned to live with a hidden tax of ambiguity, but that tax is much larger and more damaging than it looks on a balance sheet. Every time a team gets stuck because they don't know who can approve external sharing, your work slows down. When a project owner leaves and nobody knows who has the authority to renew the team, the work slows down again. If a business unit wants to launch a Power Platform solution but has to negotiate responsibilities from scratch, the entire process grinds to a halt. When compliance raises a serious concern and there is no named owner to carry that decision into action, the business stops moving. This isn't friction created by having governance in place. It is friction created by the fact that ownership is missing. To put it bluntly, ambiguity is expensive because it burns time, creates endless rework, and spikes your escalation rates. Uncertainty forces your smartest people to spend their energy navigating around roadblocks instead of moving directly through a known, clear path. And why is that? It's because speed in a modern enterprise doesn't come from a total absence of control, but from a high level of predictability. If your people know who owns the service and understand the standard path for exceptions, they can finally move with real confidence. They stop second-guessing every move, they stop workshopping every minor edge case, and they stop sending the same question into 3 different Slack channels hoping for a fast answer. This is where ownership starts creating genuine business speed, not by creating a false sense of urgency, but by providing absolute clarity. Strong ownership also reduces the friction of constant escalations that plague most large companies. In weak environments, every unusual situation gets pushed upward because nobody is quite sure who actually has the authority to say yes. That habit turns your senior leaders into permanent bottlenecks for decisions that should have been resolved much earlier and much closer to the actual work. When you design ownership well, many of those decisions never need to climb the corporate ladder because the right person is already in place. The service owner handles what belongs to the service, the data owner manages classification, and the platform owner maintains technical control. The business keeps moving because decisions land in the right place the first time, which provides a massive operational advantage for the whole company. This shift also changes the role of IT in a very healthy way by moving them out of a constant hero mode. Without clear ownership, IT becomes the catch-all function where permissions confusion, workspace cleanup, and Power Platform sprawl all go to die. The IT team ends up saving the environment through sheer manual effort, but those kinds of heroics do not scale and they are incredibly expensive to maintain. With clear ownership, IT can shift back into platform stewardship where they standardize the rails and automate the controls to keep the estate healthy. Supporting the owners is a far more sustainable model than acting as the emergency fallback for every unresolved business decision in the tenant. The same logic applies to your compliance department. When ownership is weak, compliance officers end up writing policies into a vacuum and then chasing people for evidence after the fact. This creates a constant tension because the people inside the system experience compliance as an annoying interruption instead of a support structure. When ownership is clear, compliance becomes a much stronger partner because the rules, the evidence, and the remediation paths all have a specific human name attached to them. Compliance can work through accountable operators instead of trying to govern through broad reminders and annual pressure, which makes the whole cycle move faster. The payoff is even more obvious when you look at citizen development and how teams innovate. If business teams know the path for building inside managed environments and the life cycle is built in, then innovation stops looking like grey IT work. It becomes sanctioned innovation where people move quickly without creating support nightmares that someone else has to untangle 6 months later. If you want one takeaway for this entire section, it's that ownership is not a form of bureaucracy. It is the specific mechanism that turns control from a drag on the system into a flow state for the business. Once accountability is clear, your team stop wasting time negotiating who should act and start moving through systems that already know where responsibility lives. The leadership decision underneath all of this. Even if your model is clear and your metrics are in place, one major leadership decision still sits underneath this entire structure. Executives have to stop treating Microsoft 365 as just another IT toolset because that framing is far too small for the business reality we live in today. Microsoft 365 is actually your operating infrastructure. It carries your decision flow, your collaboration, your document management, and now it carries the AI-assisted interpretation that sits on top of all those layers. When a leader says that IT owns M365, what they are really saying is that they haven't accepted that the business is now running inside this digital environment. That is the real issue we have to face. Once the business runs inside a platform, ownership becomes a business design question rather than an admin or licensing concern. You have to ask who is answerable for the conditions under which work happens and who is responsible for the quality of the information feeding your big decisions. The answer to those questions cannot be all of us because that provides moral comfort without providing any operational clarity. From a system perspective, executives have to decide if they want a model of distributed dependence with centralized blame or a model of distributed accountability with visible authority. Many organizations are still running that first model where the business depends on the platform, but risk gets pushed toward IT or security when things go wrong. That isn't governance, it is structural evasion. And it continues because naming specific owners creates real consequences for people. It means someone can be asked for evidence, someone can be measured, and someone is expected to actually improve a weak service. That is exactly why this matters so much. If leadership wants true sovereignty over their environment, they have to give their named owners authority, metrics, and a regular review cadence. Authority means the role isn't just symbolic, and the owner has enough standing to actually shape how the data domain operates. Metrics ensure that ownership can be observed rather than just announced in a meeting, and a review cadence keeps accountability alive long after the kickoff workshop ends. This is also where we need to put governance boards back in their proper place. While steering committees and cross-functional alignment are important, those boards do not actually operate your services. Boards do not clean up ownerless workspaces, they don't improve your data classification, and they certainly don't review external sharing settings one domain at a time. Operators and named owners do that work. The real question for leadership isn't about who approves the governance policy, but who is answerable for the outcomes inside the environment that now runs the entire business. That is the fundamental decision underneath everything else. If leaders choose to avoid it, the platform will simply keep scaling your dependency much faster than it scales your accountability. My name is Mirco Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality, which is why we need to talk about the practical move for your environment. You should start by building one ownership map that covers your platform, your services, and your data layers. Once that map is ready, you need to audit 4 specific areas immediately. Look for teams without owners and check for stale external sharing that hasn't been cleaned up. Identify any critical content that lacks a label and find those unmanaged Power Platform assets that are likely sitting in the shadows. From there, you can assign one accountable owner to every service domain and make that visibility a permanent part of your provisioning and review workflows. When you connect these ownership changes directly to lifecycle and HR events, the system begins to manage itself. I recommend measuring your ownership coverage and policy adherence before you decide to expand Copilot or any other AI tools across the organization. When ownership becomes a structural reality rather than a manual task, trust rises and decisions speed up because Microsoft 365 finally becomes governable again. Shared responsibility without clear ownership creates unmanaged risk inside the very platform your business now depends on every day. This week, I want you to audit just one service, one workspace type, and one critical dataset to see who actually owns the access, the lifecycle, and the quality. If you want more of this kind of structural clarity before you scale your AI strategy any further, subscribe to the M365 FM podcast and connect with me on LinkedIn. If you audited your ownership the same way you audit your technical systems, what would you find? And is that system designed to sustain your growth or slowly drain your security over time?